Good afternoon. Woo! Thank you. I first of all want to congratulate the Frankfurt School TEDxFS, for actually getting this many students out on a Saturday. Kudos. Now, we're going to switch things up a bit. We've heard a lot of personal stories. I will be sharing some of my own personal story, but I'm going to actually frame it in a business context. I work in the banking industry, so you may find a lot of what I'm talking about relevant, and I hope as you go out into the workplace, you will take my message to heart. It's absolutely critical. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the paradox of gender-neutral thinking, or to paraphrase what my daughter, who is actually a university student, calls it, why companies suck at reaching women. Now, what's interesting about this is that I guess it was in my early 30s, I had two important things that happened to me that sort of served as my come to Jesus moment around all things relating to gender. The first, and this really ties into the conference theme of perseverance, crisis, and perspective. The first is, at the tender age of 38, I got married to an aerospace engineer. There's no engineers in the room, obviously, because that usually gets a lot of laughs. Oh yeah, good, then you feel my pain. Who also comes from a family of 5 boys, and every damn one of them are engineers. Just absolutely bizarre. So, Michael, my dear husband, is one of those weirdos that can actually take a car apart, put it back together, and it still works. So this one particular day, and this was early in our marriage, I was about 8 months pregnant. Now I want you to keep this picture in your head. Okay? So, I am large. I am in the kitchen. I'm actually making muffins. Swear to God. Barefoot, pregnant, in the kitchen. So, my husband is out in the driveway doing what he does to his car. He comes in, and he's wearing, those mechanic overalls full of grease and gunk, and he says, "Joanne, I need some help with the car. Can you come out and give me a hand?" And I remember thinking, oh my God, newlywed, right? I've been invited into the inner sanctum. I got this mental image in my head of like a surgical assistant, passing him tools as he does whatever it is he does under the car. So I go out, he turns to me, and he says, "I need some weight on the front. Would you please sit on the hood of the car?" Well, when he regained consciousness, that began a whole new process, a lifelong process of teaching him all things gender, particularly as it relates to gender neutrality. Now, the second thing that happened is around the same time, again in my early 30s, I started to work in the financial services industry. So what made my job unique is that I was actually educating women about money. And it was while I was in that industry that I came to see, up close and personal, just how archaic the financial services industry was, especially with regards to women. They continually told me that they felt disenfranchised, they felt invisible, they felt like they were not taken seriously. And what's interesting is, like even in my own training as a financial planner, we were always trained to talk to the husband because he's the decision maker. On the actual forms we filled out, women's income was always categorized as secondary income, right? So no wonder women were feeling invisible. And the research actually bore this out as well. One study that was recently done showed that 67% of women actually believe that they are not taken seriously, that their financial advisors don't understand their needs and don't even want to know what they are. So it's a major, major problem. And what used to crack me up about this is that I knew the economic power of women. It was huge. Women controlled 85% of the consumer dollars spent. And not only that, if you want to look on a global basis, there was this really, this really says it all. If you take a look at the economic power of women, compare it to large countries' GDP. For example, if you look at India's GDP, 2009, was 1.2 trillion, and it jumped up to 1.8 in 2015. China, you see, 4.4 up to 6.6. But look at women, the power of women. In 2009, 1.3 trillion, 2015, $19 trillion. So I got mad. This disconnect I couldn't understand. So what I did is I started my own business. And essentially, I stopped educating women about money and started educating financial institutions about women. And I'm a gender finance expert. And what that means is, I've got the weirdest job description on the planet. I literally take a metaphorical 2x4 and go around the world thwacking bankers upside the head, helping them to try to get, to understand that this is a very critically important message. So for the last 15 years, I've been primarily working with local banks in emerging economies. Interestingly enough, I work for the Frankfurt School. And I know that many of you students are probably unaware that the school has an international advisory department, which is enormous. And they work all over the world helping the developing world in sustainable finance and gender finance and that kind of thing. So literally what I do, along with a team of experts, I will pick up a bank, turn it upside down, shake the living heck out of it, and put it back on the ground. I literally rewire the business culture in order for them to understand that women are an intrinsic part of their marketing and of their approach. But the weird thing is gender finance is not like agricultural finance or small business finance. It's not like sustainable finance. The business case there is very, very straightforward, and there's no emotion attached. But the minute you introduce gender into the equation, all kinds of red flags and barriers go up. And the reason for this is actually, every single one of us have our own closely held, often tenacious views around gender. It's a function of how we were raised, the culture we were raised in, right? We know what we know because that's what we experience. But it's these cultural differences or these cultural beliefs that make my job very difficult. What's really tough is I actually have to go to countries where honor killings and child marriages, human trafficking, the rates are some of the highest in the world. I go to countries where women are required to cover from head to toe, can't open a bank account. They can't even be seen in public without a male escort. Okay? I work in war-torn countries, post-Soviet countries where the economies are virtually decimated and the poverty levels are absolutely shocking. I have even been tear gassed twice. Honestly, twice. Talk about occupational hazard. So what's interesting is that these countries that I work in, this is where I get the most gratification. And I decided to, for the purpose of this talk, I took a small sample of the countries that I work in, and I looked at the 2017 Global Gender Gap Report. Okay, and this is done by the World Economic Forum every single year. And what I discovered was kind of interesting. First of all, it measures 144 countries around the world using an index to measure gender progress, typically based on health, education, the economy, and politics. So I just took a random sample. And of course, I threw in Germany just for comparison purposes. And you can see that the vast majority of the countries that I work in fall in the bottom third of this report. But here's a really interesting aside here. If you take a look at the Western Balkans, which I've worked in for the last few years, you can see that they kind of fall in the middle of the pack. But here's where having a gender lens is critically important, and why the sort of neutral viewpoint that most companies take in this market fails. If you focus specifically on economic empowerment, look what happens to the numbers. Albania drops to 70 from 38, Macedonia 67, it drops to 96. Indonesia, significant, 84 to 108, and lo and behold, look at Germany. It's a major economic power, one of the most progressive countries in the world, and you land at 43 out of 144 countries. So there is clearly a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. Now, one of the reasons that this continues to this day is actually based on history. If you think about the business model for most banks, arguably any corporation, and just go back even 100 years, 75 years, it's very much based on a male model, right? It was the men who went out to work, went out to war. Essentially, women were required to stay home and look after families. So if you take a look at how business gets done, even today, it's based on the male worldview. Product development, marketing, business language, definitions of success, definitions of risk, all very much based on the male worldview. So this is what makes it a tough nut to crack. Not only am I dealing with these major cultural issues, I also have to try to break through the internal corporate culture, which is, again, as I say, very male-oriented. Now, what we have found is that the vast majority of banks, in fact, every single bank out of the hundreds I've worked with, all take tremendous pride in being what they call gender neutral or gender blind. It's a badge of honor, literally. And this is precisely why it's failing. Neutral basically says it's policies, language, and other social institutions that avoid gender distinctions in order to eliminate bias. And in the banking world, and arguably in other industries, neutral typically means equal. I don't know how the hell they made that leap, but they assume just by not considering gender in their policies, they are in fact becoming a more equal institution. Now, when they talk about equality, this is essentially what they're talking about. The bankers have told me time and time again, we do not consider gender when we are adjudicating credit. It's irrelevant. Everybody is treated the same. Everybody has the same rights, resources, and opportunities, right? But let's take a closer look at what equality actually means, particularly in banking. It basically means everyone is getting the same. And this is why it doesn't work. Because everybody is getting the same. Do you get the distinction? Women and men, particularly in the world of entrepreneurship, do not have the same reality. Women are working, on average, they have 2 full-time jobs, one paid, one unpaid, which impacts the amount of time they can spend in their business, which impacts the amount of annual revenue, which impacts the type of collateral or the amount of collateral that they can gather in order to get a loan from a bank. Now, this is not a problem created by the banks, but if they want to get serious about this market, they need to address it. And they address it through the principle of equity. So if you were to look at the two side by side, see? This is what we are trying to teach bankers, is this whole principle of equity. Basically, everybody gets the same pair of shoes, or gets a pair of shoes, and they fit, as opposed to this one size fit all right? So what happens when you actually adopt an equitable business model? The results are astounding. Not only does it affect customer satisfaction and affect market share, it's what happens internally within the culture, within the bank culture. We have seen so many banks who have decided to take this seriously and have actually seen internal employee satisfaction rates go right through the roof. So to give you an example of why this is important, we worked with a bank in Turkey, and it was absolutely amazing. A woman, married, over 50, walks in a bank, asking for a loan, automatically is given a lower credit score than a male equivalent. Automatically. So we asked why. We did a deep dive in their data. And this is a tough thing to do because in a lot of these banks in the developing world, they don't disaggregate their data according to gender, so it's hit and miss. But we did a deep dive and we figured out what was happening. There was a disproportionate bump of non-performing loans or loan defaults in the transportation sector. And it was women. So we had the bank go in and find out exactly what was happening because it was just too weird. It wasn't bank-wide, just this one sector. And we uncovered a phenomenon that is actually not unusual in emerging economies. It's called fake entrepreneurship or serial entrepreneurs. What was happening is men would go out of business, their business would fail, and they would send their wives in to get the loan. And if it failed, of course, it's going to be on the wife's credit rating. And if you think that this is benign, it is not. This bank was one of the largest 5 banks in Turkey, and it was automatically giving a negative credit score to virtually every woman over 50 without even going through the credit process, right? So this is, again, another reason why we want to be sure that people or certainly banks, adopt this gender lens and actually look strategically at the needs, the preferences, the behavior of women. Because the de facto standard is male-oriented. So we have to be strategic rather than just relying on instinct. So what happens to banks that do this, that get this right, that adopt this business model of gender intelligence? This is what I call it. It's pretty interesting. As I said, I started back in my 30s. I worked with the Royal Bank of Canada. It took us 6 years, 160,000 employees. Try turning that ship around. We worked very, very diligently with the frontline salespeople, with the executives, with the credit department, getting them to understand the realities around women. Within 1 year, they saw a 10% increase in market share. Now, this is Canada. Okay, we only have 5 chartered banks, right? So, I mean, literally banks will draw blood to get a 1% increase in market share. This is very significant. But more to the point, by simply making the account managers aware of gender differences in the sales process, they experienced a 29% increase in customer satisfaction levels with women entrepreneurs and their account managers. That's pretty awesome. Now, how do you replicate this in other countries? Lebanon, Middle East, right? Women, oh God. We were pretty nervous about introducing the concept of gender intelligence into this particular bank. Holy moly. They took this concept and they ran with it. And if you look at the results as of This year, you can see that there's an 82% increase in the total of women business owners and 121% increase in outstanding loans portfolios. It's like huge, 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 huge. So this stuff works, okay? So if you ever become a CEO of a bank, I pray that you will take this message to heart, okay? And on a personal level, I'd just like to wrap up with this comment. Last week, Michael and I celebrated 25 years of marriage. Holy moly, how did that happen? Thank you very much.